Hello, and welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponderer. I'm Neil Trotter, the host of this show, and today we're going to be returning to some Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, we've done Friedrich Nietzsche on this channel several times before, and we're going back to that good old-fashioned existentialism, right? Well, I don't know how good and old it is old. Anyway, we're going to be talking about we're going to be looking at this book right here. It's the vintage edition of On the Genealogy of Morals by Nietzsche. So this is a very popular work. This is a collected edition. It also has like this other popular work among a few other excerpts from other works. But we're just going to focus on the Genealogy of Morals, and that's a very popular work of Nietzsche. Many people, in fact, think that that's his best work, his greatest work. And it is very good. It's very good in terms of the philosophical content that it has in it. And yeah, it's just talking about, hey, where do morals come from? How do morals develop over time? Morality, ethics, and what is the birth of morality in our society, and like how does it evolve? It's genealogy. Very relevant. Very direct title, and yeah, Nietzsche has some very interesting things to say about that. And a lot of times Nietzsche is on point. He's really just hits the nail on the head. Sometimes he's not on point. Sometimes he's just going all in a direction that's like, what are you talking about? But I think with the genealogy of morals, he's on point here, and he has a lot of interesting things to say. And we're going to talk about that here in the video. So let's get started. Here in the Black Ponderer, in case you're new to the program, we actually read the text. That's right. We read quotes from the text, and then I give my commentary, supplementary commentary, and then we continue that supplementary commentary in the comment section below. That's how we roll here. So we do some direct citing from the text. So I don't know if you got this edition. This is an old ass beat up edition. I don't know if they probably don't sell these anymore. It's probably a newer edition, but maybe they do. I don't know. This is the vintage edition translated by Walter Kaufmann, one of the popular translators of Nietzsche. And I mention that because I'm going to be giving you the page numbers in case you want to follow along, because a lot of people will say, hey, can you just give me some page numbers so I can read along with you? So there you go. I didn't used to do that because I assume not everybody had my edition, because I oftentimes have old ass editions of stuff. But hey, people are asking for it, so I'm gonna give it to you. This is page 44, okay? And this is the third paragraph. But grant me from time to time, if there are divine goddesses in the realm beyond good and evil, grant me the sight, but one glance of something perfect, wholly achieved, happy, mighty, triumphant, something still capable of arousing fear, of a man who just defies man, a complimentary and redeeming lucky hit on the part of man, for the sake of which one may still believe in man. So one of the things about Nietzsche is that he is a very flamboyant writer. I think he's pretty good. He's a lot. He knows how to write. He's not like Hegel or Kant, who kind of doesn't really know how to write in a way that's easily understandable and compelling, right? But they all got good ideas. But Nietzsche writes in a very compelling, compassionate, very passionate way, right? And so, what is he saying in this quote here? I put in my notes here. There is divinity, but not in our current flawed models of morality. So, Nietzsche, he was an atheist, right? He did always criticized religion, specifically church, like the Christian church, Christian institutions, right? However, he did acknowledge a kind of transcendental human nature, human energy that is within the human capability, right? He talks about that a lot in like his concept of the Overman or the Superman, or however you want to say it, and also at various other different times. And here he's saying like, look, there is that kind of transcendental thing that, you know, people often associate with the divine, right? But it's not in our current morality. That's not it. And then I put in my notes here, people are overcome with nihilism, right? You know, people don't even believe in man anymore, right? People have lost faith in humanity, right? And Nietzsche was all about, hey man, we gotta believe in the human being again. You know, that's where you can get that transcendental feeling, you know, that I'm trying to avoid terms like the divine because he was an atheist, right? But he did still think like, okay, there's something beyond just the material, right? But it's a kind of like will, you know, a transcendental will, right? And it starts with you believing in yourself as a being who can transcend, right? And we've lost that, right? In fact, our morality kills that desire out of us, right? That's what he's saying there. But let me continue. For this, how things are, the diminution and leveling of European man constitutes our greatest danger, for the sight of him makes us weary. We can see nothing today that wants to grow greater. We suspect that things will continue to go down to become thinner, more good-natured, more prudent, more comfortable, more mediocre, more indifferent, more Chinese, more Christian. There is no doubt that man is getting better all the time. You know, and so he talks us like, oh, they're getting more Chinese, more Christian. He's just using these things as labels, right? He's just saying, oh, they're getting more this, more that, more whatever, you know, more westernized, more like Eastern thinking, you know, more Buddhist, you know, more civilized, you know, these kinds of terms that are just tossed around. And you know what Nietzsche is saying, like these terms, these categories are stunting our desire to evolve as human beings, right? Because we got these categories that are locking us in. But here we go. Here precisely is what has become a fatality for Europe. Together with the fear of man, we have also lost our love of him, our reverence for him, our hopes for him, even the will to him. The sight of man now makes us weary. What is nihilism today if it is not that? We are weary of man. Okay, so I put in my notes here in the margins. The myth of Western civilization, right? The hypocrisy of Westernization centers cynicism. That's what must be overcome. You know? So yeah, it's interesting because there's these issues that he brings up, Nietzsche. He's saying like, you know, this idea like we're becoming more westernized as a civilization. And so there's that, which people buy into that kind of myth of like, yes, Western civilization, you know, Eurocentrism, you know, the Enlightenment was the start of a new dawn of humanity. And now we are rising and becoming more better. And it's like, no, those things are just falsehoods, right? And they're like bringing us down, you know. So there's that, and then he brings up like there, you know, the idea that there are people who understand that that's false, you know, and the fact that that's jammed down our throats. This myth of Westernization, like, oh, you know, Western civilization is what saves us. That makes people cynical and nihilistic. It's like, yeah, whatever. You're saying all this shit, but I'm still broke. I'm still, you know, not realizing my dreams. I'm still lonely. The American dream is dead, blah, 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 blah. You know, you have this. So it brings people down into this whole spiral of nihilism, and they stop believing in humanity, right? The capability of the human to rise up and become better. And Nietzsche's saying like, all of this is just traps. So that, you know, there's two things going on here. All right, so I put in my notes, nihilism, apathy, selfishness, and self-centeredness are the new versions of strength, right? So, yeah, we've got to this point where, you know, if you believe life sucks, or if you know, kind of like this I don't give a fuck attitude, or like my life's a bitch and then you die, you know, you look cool when you say that. You know, you're like, yeah, I know, like, fuck humans. Like, and then it's like, you know, that's a kind of this whole attitude that's relevant today, or this apathy that's becoming the norm. And then when people are like they rise up and they say, no, we actually should do something about this. We should care. You know, that's like, you're not cool. You're actually weak when you have that kind of attitude, right? That's kind of the notion of today, right? So there's that. And then, so that also drives you toward a kind of selfishness. It's like, well, if life sucks and there's really, you know, there's no real hope for humanity, all I should care about is myself, you know, and what I'm doing. Like, fuck everybody else. And then that becomes like this cool, like, thing that's attributed to people, right? People start to admire that, right? This self-centeredness that's based off of nihilism, but also just based off of the myth of Western civilization. Right? So it's a lot of things going on here. Right? But let me keep reading. This is page 45, second paragraph. To demand of strength that it should not express itself as strength, that it should not be a desire to overcome, a desire to throw down, a desire to become master, a thirst for enemies and resistances and triumphs, is just as absurd as the demand of weakness that it should express itself as strength. So, you know, I'm putting Nietzsche's ideas into the context of today, right? Because, you know, we'll talk about this later on in the video. Nietzsche is more, he's focused on like how Christian morality and kind of religion in general kind of focuses more on like this passiveness, this kind of non-violence in a passive way, right? Where, you know, actual like non-violent activism is actually not even close to being passive, right? But Nietzsche is not necessarily talking about that. He's talking about, you know, this kind of martyrism that religion pushes, particularly during his day, and that is what's denying people of actually taking action. It's interesting because that's not so much the case anymore, right? In today's world. In fact, like, I would argue religion kind of encourages violence nowadays and becoming a master, right, and dominating, right? That's kind of, you know, the manifest destiny kind of thing. But I think Nietzsche's point still applies because people, they're seeing the lies and the hypocrisies of religion, and that's making them passive. That's making them say like, oh, who cares, right? There's that, and then, but there's also like people who still believe in religion, and they believe the religion doing good, and they don't have to do anything to change the negative aspects of their religion. That's still very much alive today, and that creates a kind of passiveness. So it still applies, right? And I put in my notes here, apathy must be overcome. It is the great evil of today, right? And it is, right? You see, people see the world today, and there's many different reactions. There's the hopelessness, which is not apathy, right? That's just like an absolute sadness. But then there's also this idea of like, well, you know, fuck it, you know, who cares? You know, I'm just gonna live my life, and, you know, the hell with the world, and we're all gonna die someday, you know. Judgment Day is coming, Armageddon is here, you know, let's just dance in the fire as it burns, you know, the dog meme, drinking the coffee with surrounded by flames, and he's like, this is fine. Right? That is a huge problem of today's world, right? It's like, you know, people need to start like getting over that and start like acting. And Nietzsche is saying like, yeah, that's something you need to get over to actually grow as a person. And that's a problem that human beings have always wrestled with. And for some reason, we are not wrestling with it, you know, whereas human beings used to, but now we're not. And then I put in my notes here, strength is morality, and our conception of strength is perverted. So yeah, this idea that to be strong is to not give a damn, you know, and to kind of just do your own thing and like hustle for yourself and like fuck the world, that's what's really strong. And when you're like compassionate and kind and like care about other people, that's considered weak, right? You know, the whole woke thing, right? Or that's a derogatory term now. You know, that's not even like, you're not strong when you stand up for people anymore. You're strong when you like kick people to the curb and kind of get your own thing. That's strength today, right? And so there's a confusion of, or a perversion of ethics and morality. So we're still on page 45. This is the 12th line. So popular morality else separates strength from expression of strength, as if there were a neutral substratum behind the strong man, which was free to express strength or not to do so. But there is no substratum. There is no being behind doing, affecting, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything, right? And so that's the whole idea of belief in something. And, this idea that, well, if I believe in something, then I'm doing it, right? And it's like, well, the whole idea of like, well, faith alone, I move by faith, not by sight, or like, I'm saved by faith. That's an old school Christian term popularized by Martin Luther. Right, the original Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., who was named after, the founder of Protestantism. One big tenet of that is saved by faith alone, right? But Nietzsche is like, okay, but you still need to do stuff, right? And just because you believe in something doesn't necessarily mean you're doing it. And you could flip that and say, well, it's the same thing with apathy, with this apathetic type of attitude, where it's like you think you're doing something when you're like, fuck the world, I'm gonna do me, and the hell with people, I've lost my faith in humanity. But like, yeah, that's you in your head thinking these things. It's not actually like, you're not developing yourself, right? But I guess a counter argument would be like, well, these people, they don't have interest in doing that. they're kind of trapped in this spiral of downward depression. But Nietzsche would argue, and I kind of agree, like, well, no, actually that kind of idea, that kind of attitude is advertised as action, right? That attitude is advertised as a kind of morality, a kind of like ethics of this whole like, fuck the world, I'm gonna do me, right? But it's just an attitude. It's not actually like a doing something. Here we are on page 46. This is line 8. We weak ones are after all weak. It would be good if we did nothing for which we are not strong enough, but this dry matter of fact, I skipped down a line, has, thanks to the counterfeit and self-deception of impotence, clad itself in the ostentatious garb of the virtue of quiet, calm resignation. Just as if weakness of the weak, that is to say their essence, their effects, their soul, ineluctable, irremovable reality, were a voluntary achievement, will chosen, a deed of meritorious act. And so that's exactly what I was just saying before about, the resignation, the hopelessness, like, oh, man, the world's going to shit. There's no hope. I've lost my faith in humanity, and now you're in that kind of position is like, oh, so that gives me some sort of merit. And you see that a lot of like social media, where people will just post memes of hopelessness and apathetic memes of, and then they're like, yeah, I'm in the know. I know I'm doing stuff. It's kind of like this salve or this like escapist way of like, feeling like you're doing something when you're actually not, right? And you almost have this kind of feeling of like, yeah, I'm doing some good stuff here. Then you get your likes and your like thumbs ups, and you get your comments, and you're like, and it becomes like this morality, right? But you're not really doing anything. This type of man needs to believe in a neutral, independent subject, prompted by an instinct for self-preservation and self-affirmation, in which every lie is sanctified, right? So, there needs to be like more of a focus on you as a subject actually doing something, right? Instead of just like submitting to the conditions of your situation. Make more of an effort to be like, no, I'm actually going to actually do something about this. Skip down 3 lines. The sublime self-deception that interprets weakness as freedom, and their being thus and thus as a merit. And I put in my notes here. The fuck it, we're gonna die anyway, or the only focus on myself and my inner circle manufactures the practicality that is falsely mistaken as strength or morality, right? This idea is like, well, you can't really change the world. You can't do it, you're just one person. I mean, you can only affect your inner circle, right? At the most. You know, just focus on your little immediate family, right? And, you know, the whole world be damned, right? And then now you're seen as like, oh, now you're being realistic. You know, that's good on you. You're being realistic because you can't really do anything practical about like the world at large, right? And that kind of attitude, Nietzsche says that's ridiculous. Like human beings all the time do things that change the world. Individual human beings do things all the time that change the world. We've lost this. We've lost this aspect because we're stuck in this like apathetic self-centeredness, this sublime self-deception that makes us feel like we're free. You know, we feel free when we're posting memes on the internet. You know, I'm expressing my autonomy. No, you're not actually. You're just bending to the will of apathy, right? Which is being forced upon you by the powers that are actually oppressing you. Right? But if you start like being more hopeful and like actually going out and doing things that can make a change, you know, not for yourself and for everybody else. And I guess Nietzsche would argue, and I would too, that changing yourself also changes everybody around you and changes the world. It's true. You know, I'm a believer in the ripple effect thing. Existence is a vast sea, and you know, you are just a drop. Your actions are a drop that ripple throughout the sea. Right? I'm one of those. So let's talk about how Nietzsche takes this conception of the state of morality today, and how does he like develop it, and how does he says like this is where it's going, this is where it has taken us. I'm gonna read page 63, the 14th line here. Throughout the greater part of human history, punishment was not imposed because one held the wrongdoer responsible for his deed, thus not on the presupposition that only the guilty one should be punished. Rather, as parents still punish their children from anger at some harm or injury vented on the one who caused it, but this anger is held in check and modified by the idea that every injury has its equivalent and can actually be paid back, even if only through the pain of the culprit. And whence did the primeval, deeply rooted, perhaps by now ineradicable idea draw its power? This idea of an equivalence between injury and pain. I have already divulged it in the contractual relationship between creditor and debtor, which is as old as the idea of legal subjects, and in turn points back to the fundamental forms of buying, selling, barter, trade, and traffic. The creditor and the debtor, which is like much older than capitalism. You know, you owe me something. And this has transferred over to the realm of morality. And so now justice is, you know, a kind of like debt credit system. Punitive justice is ethics of business. So, you know, our ethics has become our moral system, like the criminal justice system today, which is, you know, a system supposedly based off of morality and senses of justice, is mostly just based off of business and economics. This conception of, well, there's a creditor and there's a debtor, and you got to pay back what you owe. You injured somebody, now you have a debt to pay. Let's continue. Page 64, 10th line here. The debtor made a contract with the creditor and pledged that if he should fail to repay, he would substitute something else that he possessed, something he had control over, for example, his body, his wife, his freedom, or even his life, or given certain religious presuppositions, even his bliss after death, the salvation of his soul, ultimately his peace in the grave. And I skip down 3 lines. Above all, however, the creditor could inflict every kind of indignity and torture upon the body of the debtor. I'll put in my notes. Thus our warped conception of sacrifice. Right. So Nietzsche's now transition over to something else, right? He's talking about, this is where our criminal justice system kind of started off. Began with this idea of creditor and debtor. But what I would like to say is, insert my supplementary commentary, is that, because we kind of lose faith in humanity, right? Because we are kind of apathetic about human nature. Or like, we see human beings as like these machines that can't really process ethics. We're kind of more of a, ultimately this idea of human beings as this like self-centered, narcissistic, cruel animal, right? That we've kind of like embraced that idea. And also the other idea of like, well, life doesn't really mean anything anyway, right? Denialism. So there's two things going on, as I've said before. You got the hyper-religious people who embrace that idea like human beings are just, less than dirt. And the only way we are valuable is through God and, the debt that God paid for us, right? That kind of idea. So there's that kind of debt idea. God is the creditor, we're the debtor. So there's that whole notion, which can foster this punitive justice system that we have currently. And then the other side is this idea of hopelessness, nihilism. Well, life doesn't really mean anything anyway. So how can we like order society without life being meaningless? Oh, we'll just like make life into some business. Like we'll just like have life becomes like facts and figures, just the economics. Like morality will just make some sort of economic thing. Well, it doesn't matter anyway, so why don't we just machinify it? Or just like make it into like a system of like objectivity. Hence, we have our current criminal justice system, which is based off of punitive justice, this debtor-creditor thing. Here's the last paragraph on page 64. Let us be clear as to the logic of this form of compensation. It is strange enough. An equivalence is provided by the creditors receiving in place of a literal compensation for an injury, thus in place of money, land, possessions of any kind. A recompense in the form of a kind of pleasure, the pleasure of being allowed to vent his power freely upon one who is powerless, voluptuous pleasure, the enjoyment of violation. The enjoyment will be the greater the lower the creditor stands in the social order, and can easily appear to him as a most delicious morsel, indeed as a foretaste of higher rank. In punishing, the debtor, the creditor, participates in a right of the masters. At last, he too may experience from once the exalted sensation of being allowed to despise and mistreat someone as beneath him, or at least if the actual power and administration of punishment has already passed to the authorities, to see him despised and mistreated. The compensation then consists in a warrant for and title to cruelty. Okay, so then I put in my notes here. This rationalizes the morality of capitalism, the ethics of exploitation, and classism, right? We have these social economic systems, right? Which, capitalism essentially is based off of exploitation, right? It's an exploitative system, and this idea of like social class, social economic class, this idea like, some people just make more money because they work harder, quote unquote. Well, as we know, a lot of money, most wealth is inherited, so people who are rich work a lot less than poor people, right? Or people who don't have much money, right? But there's this justification that's being used here that Nietzsche talks about. And that transfers over to our criminal justice system, which actually serves the purposes of capitalism. It's all interrelated in that way. So there's this moral rationalization happening for this cruelty of like, prison, for example, should be cruel. Like people, prison should not be something that's pleasant to be in. It should be a torture chamber, essentially, which is what prisons are. But, that's good because criminals should be punished because they owe a debt in society, and how they make up for that debt is through torture, subjection to violence. You know, this is how they pay back society, right? And there's even a kind of a pleasure in that. Hence why you got propaganda, right? Or like all these cop TV shows that are very popular, particularly here in the United States of America. You know, there's kind of this whole enjoyment in, you know, seeing the idea of like somebody who's injured society through crime get caught and then having to pay for that injury to society through punitive action, through violence inflicted on the person that caused the injury. Okay, so this is the second paragraph on page 65, the 10th line. To what extent can suffering balance debts or guilt? To the extent that to make sufferer was in the highest degree pleasurable, to the extent that the injured party exchanged for the loss he had sustained, including the displeasure caused by the loss, an extraordinary counterbalancing pleasure, that of making suffer a genuine festival, something which, as aforesaid, was prized the more highly, the more violently it contrasted with the rank and social standing of the creditor. I put in my notes, violence has been fetishized as a warped ethics of justice, punitive justice. That's honestly what punitive justice is, or what our criminal justice system is today. It's basically a fetishization of violence. It's using violence to appease our desire to seek justice, to like meet the demand of our notions of injustice. Like, oh man, I've been wronged. I need to see somebody suffer. And once you see somebody suffer, it's like, yes. It's almost like a drug, right? Because it doesn't last. It just, you know, you see the person who's quote unquote wronged you, or maybe not even wronged you. Like you just feel wrong and you just see criminals suffer and you're like, yes. But then you go right back to like, oh, but I've been wronged. You know, and you go back to your downward spiral of like, you're always feeling wrong because it's the systems that are wronging you, not the actual people. But I will continue. This is the last line on page 65. Whoever clumsily interposes the concept of revenge does not enhance his insight into the matter, but further veils and darkens it. For revenge merely leads us back to the same problem. How can making suffer constitute a compensation, right? Wait, so we're into this circular problem. You get revenge, you see the person that wronged you suffer, or you see, you know, the criminal that suffers, and this is a symbol of your revenge. You know, it's like, yes, I got my revenge, but then it doesn't really help you. That, you know, ultimately, like you're still back into like this horrible emotional situation of feeling wronged because the thing hasn't actually been addressed, right? It's just someone that was associated as doing the problem was exposed to violence. But you're still in this emotional turmoil because the root cause of the problem has still not been addressed. So we're on page 66. This is the 14th line. The ever-increasing spiritualization and deification of cruelty, which permeates the entire history of higher culture. You know, today's torture porn, right? You see mainstream media today, movies and popular television shows, it's just trauma porn, isn't it? You see it, it's just like, you know, I'm talking about like a lot of this dystopian stuff, like, you know, although, you know, I guess The Walking Dead, that show's kind of not, it's kind of tapering off, but those kinds of shows where it's just like trauma after trauma after trauma, or like, you know, I mean, there was, you know, you look at horror movies today, right? Horror movies, you know, back in the day, like the 80s, they were more like slasher and they were like more unrealistic horror, or, you know, like Mortal Kombat, the video game, where it was violent, but it was like this kind of hyper violence that was not realistic. It was almost cartoonish or Looney Tunes-esque. A lot of the old school horror movies like that. Today's horror movies are like very realistically violent, in the sense that they're not too far off from violence today, from extreme violence today. And we fetishize that now. Isn't that interesting? And a lot of dramas are like, you know, a lot of the climaxes and like the problems deal with like extreme trauma. And it's important to talk about trauma and like, you know, dealing with that. But, you know, I think we should do it in a way that is healthy and like actually provides sort of like a constructive conversation rather than just being there for entertainment purposes, right? Which kind of gives us this desensitized version of trauma, which ultimately desensitizes us from the effects of trauma, or kind of fosters this whole nihilism or like apathy, like, well, you know, life is traumatizing anyway, so it is what it is, right? He's kind of like supporting this whole like, yeah, you know, humanity's hopeless, and this is what human beings are. And it's like, well, that's not what all of human beings are, but we have this kind of notion through our entertainment. So now we're on page 67. This is the second paragraph. With this idea, by the way, I am by no means concerned to furnish our pessimists with more grist for their discordant and creaking meals of life satiety. On the contrary, let me declare expressively that in the days when mankind was not yet ashamed of its cruelty, life on earth was more cheerful than it is now that pessimists exist. So again, we're going to what Nietzsche was talking about, is this idea, you know, Christianity and like religion promoted more of a passiveness of like, you know, a martyrism, much more of like a sainthood state where it's like, you know, you get slapped, you turn the other cheek, right? And you prepare for the next slap, which is, you know, the thing Jesus said, and you don't fight back or like embrace your base instincts to like actually fight. I am for nonviolence myself. So I think what Nietzsche's saying here was like, okay, that's being taken too far. Like, we need to be more, we need to acknowledge that human beings can be cruel, and then not be afraid of it, but use it to make ourselves better rather than just relishing in it, right? So that's where he's taking it. His critique is taking it. But what I'm saying, where I'm coming at it from, is I'm kind of like modernizing it and taking it to today, because, you know, today religion isn't, you know, that's not really a problem of religion today, right? You know, the martyrism, the sainthood, to like, you know, non-violent, and you know, religion sadly doesn't really promote, institutionalized religion today does not promote nonviolence. You know, on the contrary, right? It actually promotes a lot of cruelty. And so what I'm saying is like, I still think you can apply what Nietzsche is saying here to this deification of cruelty. And it's true, like, we should acknowledge that exists. Like, we should acknowledge that human beings are capable of extreme cruelty, but let's not like just get stuck there, right? or let's not like settle for like, well, that's all there is, that's what human beings, that's all we are, which is kind of where we're at today in popular media, where it's like, no, we gotta rise above it, but we can't rise. The other thing, you don't want to have like a Hallmark like type of a Hallmark channel type of attitude about it either, where it gets all cheesy and corny. It's like good always triumphs over evil and all that. Like, no, we have to like acknowledge the cruelty. We gotta be realistic about it. But, you know, part of the realism is acknowledging like, yeah, like human beings can rise above their cruelty and do extremely good, positive things. That happens all the time. But when we see cruelty happen, we need to act against it. We can't just accept it, right? You know, so that's where I'm going. The darkening of the sky above mankind has deepened in step with the increase in man's feeling of shame at man. The weary, pessimistic glance, mistrust of the riddle of life, the icy no of disgust with life, right? It's like, no, this world is too horrible. I can't deal with it. I have to escape. It's like, no, you don't need to escape. You gotta like, we gotta be in it. We gotta be in this mud and we gotta like clean it up. Get your mop, get your towel. Let's start cleaning up this shithole, right? That's what I'm saying. Like, instead of being ashamed, I mean, shame is part of it. It's like, yeah, man, we really fucked up as a society. Look at where we're at now. We should be ashamed of ourselves. Now, that should motivate us to do better, to actually do good, rather than like just get caught in the shame and that's it. Like, just be shamed all the damn time. It's like, at a certain point, you do need to be like, all right, we can do better than this. Let's try. This is my notes. This is my notation right here. The acceptance of man's base instincts as ultimate reality is what needs to be overcome. So strive beyond base instinct to something more is human. So what does it mean to be human? Being human, and this is just my words, is looking at the cruelty that we can do and being like, no, we can do better. We can do better than this, right? And then taking steps to do better. And for me, like, that's what it means to be a human being, right? As opposed to like all the other animals, right? All the other animals, they have qualities too. But I think with human beings, we have the capability to look at our base instinct cruelty and just recognize like, yeah, we can fuck up like that, but we can do better, right? And that's a quality that human beings have that many other animal species don't. Now, do we actualize that quality? Oftentimes, no. But a lot of times we do, right? But they're not popular today, right? They're not popularized, And they're also not presented in a very realistic way. They're presented more in a corny way nowadays. But that's what I'm getting at. Let me skip down 3 lines. I mean the morbid softening and moralization through which the animal man finally learns to be ashamed of all his instincts. And I put in my notes here, the dehumanizing notion of that's just how it is. That's it. I mean, that's what it is, man. You look at the state of the world, you're like, wow, it's fucked up. Life's a bitch. And then you die, and it's like, that's a dehuman. I argue like, well, that's not human. That's like, well, most other animals do that. They're like, either they just see the cruelty or like they're just in it. They're just in the cruelty and they just live it. But human beings could be like, no, we can do better than this, right? We can rise, like, it doesn't have to be this way. We can do better. And to me, that's human. Okay, this is the second paragraph on page 68. What really arouses indignation against suffering is not suffering as such, but the senselessness of suffering. But neither for the Christian, who has interpreted a whole mysterious machinery of salvation into suffering, nor for the naive man of more ancient times, who understood all suffering in relation to the spectator of it, or the causer of it, was there any such thing as senseless suffering, so as to abolish hidden, undetected, unwitnessed suffering from the world, and honestly to deny it. One was in the past virtually compelled to invest gods and genii of all the heights and depths. I skip down 3 lines. For it was with the aid of such inventions that life then knew how to work the trick which it has always known how to work, that of justifying itself, of justifying its evil. I put in my notes here. Coming to terms with the reality that some suffering has no meaning behind it, our denial to accept this deifies suffering. You just have to accept there's suffering that happens, and it just happens. Like, it doesn't mean anything. That is the tragedy of existence that we have to come to terms with. And so this notion of fairness and creditor-debtor, like, it kind of gets obliterated, right? Because sometimes people will suffer and there's just no rhyme or reason why the suffering is happening. It just is what it is. And sometimes that's the nature of suffering. And it's hard to accept that. It's hard to accept, like, when something horrible happens and you struggle to find reasoning for it. You're like, why? But there must be a reason. What did I do? Who did what? there's got to be a reason for this, but sometimes there is no reason. It just happens. Now, you know, something very horrible happens and you're desperately trying to seek meaning. But of course, the thing about existentialism is life inherently has no meaning. In that great existentialist, like Nietzsche would say, like, we associate meaning onto the meaningless, right? But sometimes that's not always a good thing to do. Now, when I say, like, sometimes people suffer and there's no meaning to it, that's not the same thing as to be nihilistic, to say like, oh, you know, we just suffer and it just sucks and oh, it's horrible and it's all what you can't get sunk into despair about that. About like, you know, oh well, I guess I just won't try in life, right? It's like, well, no, it's just you got to be strong. That's where the strength comes in. It's just accepting that, right? And continuing to move forward, despite the fact that sometimes great suffering has no meaning behind it. And then this is the top of page 69. Every evil, the sight of which edifies a god, is justified. Thus spoke the primitive logic of feeling, right? And so Nietzsche is like saying, you know, that's the kind of evil where we begin to associate meaning with suffering that has no meaning. And we give all these false meanings to different kinds of suffering. That's a kind of evilness because it just promotes more suffering. It deifies suffering. It just propagates suffering, right? And so that's a kind of evil for Nietzsche. All right, this is the top of page 70. To return to our investigation, the feeling of guilt, of personal obligation, had its origin, as we saw, in the oldest and most primitive personal relationship, that between buyer and seller, creditor and debtor. It was here that one person first encountered another person, that one person first measured himself against another. No grade of civilization, however low, has yet been discovered in which something of this relationship has not been noticeable. Setting prices, determining values, contriving equivalences, exchanging, these preoccupied the earliest thinking of man to so great an extent that in a certain sense they constitute thinking as such. Here it was that the oldest kind of astuteness developed. Here, likewise, we may suppose, did human pride, the feeling of superiority in relation to other animals, have its first beginnings. Perhaps our word man still expresses something of precisely this feeling of self-satisfaction. Man designated himself as the creature that measures values, evaluates and measures as a evaluating animal as such. So is this what makes us human beings? How we commodify shit? You know, the fact that we form these creditor-debtor relationships, maybe that's what makes us human. Or that's a quality of man. And I put in my notes, the commodification of value is a dehumanizing of morality, right? I put in my notes. So I think that's, you know, Nietzsche's kind of onto something. Maybe that's a base instinct that man has, that human beings have. This instinct like, oh, we need to put value toward anything. Everything has a value, right? So let's commodify like everything, even morality. Let's start commodifying morality. So base instincts, all animals, all living things have like base instincts, but human beings can recognize like, oh, okay, this is a problem that I'm having. Like this base instinct is something I should not like center my life around. I should manage it. Like this drive that I have to associate value on everything, I should kind of keep that in check, right? You know, I would argue like, no, that's a human capability to do that. I think Nietzsche would say like, well, no, actually that's what makes us human, but that's why we got to rise above, you know, humanity and become like the overman or the superman or whatever his term was for that, and thus spoke the Zarathustra. That's something I don't really personally don't buy into, that whole notion of like, well, you know, we need to rise above our humanity or become like these superhumans, right? Through, you know, and that's an example of doing that, like rising above the human drive to associate value in everything. But anyway, let's keep going here. Let's skip down 9 lines. The eye was now focused on this perspective, and with that blunt consistency characteristic of the thinking of primitive mankind, which is hard to set in motion, but then proceeds inexorably in the same direction, one forthwith arrived at the great generalization: everything has its price. All things can be paid for. The oldest and naivest moral canon of justice, the beginning of all good-naturedness, all fairness, all goodwill, all objectivity. On earth, justice on this elementary level is the goodwill among parties of approximately equal power to come to terms with one another, to reach an understanding by means of a settlement, and to compel parties of lesser power to reach a settlement among themselves. So yeah, that idea of like everything has a price. and it permeated into our ideas of fairness. And so now he's talking about like, this is where morality comes from, right? This is the true genealogy. He's tracing the genealogy of morality back to this idea, right? And I put in my notes here, the value of personhood is a commodity. A person is a product. You are as good as what you can produce, you know. That's where that idea comes from. And you know, I kind of more or less agree with that. Like there, at some point there was this time where people embraced this idea, formulated this idea of like everything has a price. Even justice has a price. you can associate justice with like commodities, right? And you can commodify moral action, and you know, and we'll create a system that is based off of this idea, which we now have as our criminal justice system. Okay, let's read page 77. This is the 12th line. Whatever exists, having somehow come into being, is again and again reinterpreted to new ends, taken over, transformed, and redirected by some power superior to it. All events in the organic world are a subduing, a becoming master, and all subduing and becoming master involves a fresh interpretation and adaptation through which any previous meaning and purpose are necessarily obscured or even obliterated. However, well one has understood the utility of any physiological organ, or of a legal institution, a social custom, a political usage, a form in art, or in a religious cult, this means nothing regarding its origin. However uncomfortable and disagreeable this may sound to older ears, for one had always believed that to understand the demonstrable purpose, the utility of a thing, a form, or an institution was also to understand the reason why it originated. The eye being made for seeing, the hand being made for grasping. You know, and he's just talking about here is, yeah, you gotta look at morality as this utilitarian thing. Like, is morality really about what's right and what's wrong? No, morality is about what serves the purposes of the social institutions, or the most powerful people. and so what is most useful in terms of society, and when we're talking about society, we're talking about political usage, political usage in society. That's what works. That's how morality is fostered and matured and evolved through a political usage, not by necessarily what is right and what's wrong. In the excerpt I just read, he talked about like it's about how the thing was originated, not necessarily the meaning behind the thing. Let me keep reading. Thus, one also imagined that punishment was devised for punishing, but purposes and utilities are only signs that a will to power has become master of something less powerful and imposed upon it the character of a function. In the entire history of a thing, an organ, a custom can in this way be a continuous sign chain of ever new interpretations and adaptations whose causes do not even have to be related to one another, but on the contrary, in some cases succeed and alternate with one another in a purely chance fashion. The evolution of a thing, a custom, an organ, is thus by no means its progresses toward a goal, even less illogical progresses by the shortest route, and with the smallest expenditure of force, but a succession of more or less profound, more or less mutually independent processes of subduing, plus the resistances they encounter, the attempts at transformation for the purpose of defense and reaction, and the results of successful counteractions. The form is fluid, but the meaning is even more so. He's mentioning like the whole idea of master-slave morality, right? The idea that morality that is able to subordinate others becomes the prevailing one. This kind of like social Darwinist type of idea of survival of the fittest, but in a social Darwinist type of idea, like moralities arise by the ones that are better utilized by people in power, are the ones that benefit people in power more, are the ones that are that succeed in society. So punitive justice is the justice that succeeded, as opposed to transformative justice or restorative justice or other kinds of versions of justice, because punitive justice was the one that served the aims and the objectives and the interests of those in power the best. So that's why our current criminal justice system is based off of punishment and violence to deliver justice. And I put in my notes, morals don't persist because they are the most righteous, rather because they are most dominant. They are most effective drives of the will to power. And it's the will to power. It's a Nietzschean concept. And that's interesting. We'll be talking about that later in the video, about how morality is basically a manifestation of man's will to power. Right? Is Nietzsche's ultimate point here. Okay, this is page 81, second paragraph. It is clear that punishment is overdetermined by utilities of all kinds. All the more reason then for deducting from it a supposed utility that, to be sure, counts in the popular consciousness as the most essential one. Belief in punishment, which for several reasons is tottering today, always finds its strongest support in this. So I put in my notes, in this way we have moralized punishment as a methodology of justice, right? Because it's the belief in punishment, which has been rammed down our throats by the people with the most power. And that ramming down our throats is the people with the most social economic power exerting their will to power. We're still on page 81. This is the third paragraph, second line. Prisons and penitentiaries are not the kind of hotbed in which this species of gnawing worm is likely to flourish. All conscientious observers are agreed on that, in many cases unwillingly enough and contrary to their own inclinations. Generally speaking, punishment makes men hard and cold. It concentrates, it sharpens the feeling of alienation, it strengthens the power of resistance. If it happens that punishment destroys the vital energy and brings about a miserable prostration, and such a result is certainly even less pleasant than the usual effects of punishment, characterized by dry and gloomy seriousness. So, and I put in my notes, we ultimately know punishment doesn't work as a true method of justice. We understand that. But this is an example of morals not actually based on conceptions of righteousness. Like, we know, like, prisons don't actually reform people. People might lie and say, like, oh, reforming does happen, like, but everybody ultimately knows, like, yeah, prison is a horrible place to be. It's just gonna harden the criminal even more, and it's not gonna make the situation better. It just appeases this corrupted sense of justice that we've been willed to believe by those in power. Right now, I'm starting to use Nietzschean terminology. Okay, page 82. This is the 7th line. We must not underrate the extent to which the sight of the judicial and executive procedures prevent the criminal from considering his deed, the type of his action, as such, reprehensible. For he sees exactly the same kind of actions practiced in the service of justice and approved of and practiced with a good conscience. Spying, deception, bribery, setting traps, the whole cunning and underhand art of police and prosecution, plus robbery, violence, defamation, imprisonment, torture, murder, practice as a matter of principle and without even emotion to excuse them, which are pronounced characteristics of the various forms of punishment, all of them, therefore, actions which his judges in no way condemn and repudiate as such, but only when they are applied and directed to certain particular ends. So Nietzsche's basically critiquing the criminal justice system in an extreme way, saying like, the criminal realizes like, hey man, I'm the one being punished for causing violent action, but you guys do violent action. The judge, the police officers, the prosecutors, they're doing violent things all the time, and they're doing them to me, and it's okay when they do it, right? And so and again, so there's the people who buy into that, and then there's also a huge segment of society who just sees the hypocrisy and is like, it becomes like numb to it, becomes more apathetic, and that's what we have to fight against, right? The apathy of that. But I like that, a hardcore critique of our criminal justice system. And then, some people will say, well, it's a broken system, it doesn't work. But what Nietzsche is saying is, only when they are applied and directed to certain particular ends, it does work. Because it's being applied to the ends of people in power, right? For the people in power and what they're interested in, which is maintaining their wealth and their fortune and their status quo, right, is working very well. Is meeting their ends. Let's read page 92. This is the top. The beginning of the human race, its primal ancestor who is from now on burdened with a curse, Adam, original sin, unfreedom of the will, or of nature from whose womb mankind arose and into whom the principle of evil is projected from now on, the diabolizing of nature, or of existence in general, which is now considered worthless as such, nihilistic withdrawal from it, a desire for nothingness or a desire for its antithesis, for a different mode of being, Buddhism and the like, suddenly we stand before the paradoxical and horrifying expedient that afforded temporary relief from tormented humanity, that stroke of genius on the part of Christianity. God himself sacrificed himself for the guilt of mankind, but God himself makes payment to himself. God as the only being who can redeem man from what has become unredeemable for man himself. The creditor sacrifices himself for his debtor out of love. Can one credit that out of love for his debtor? Nietzsche presents these three issues. The nihilistic nothing matters. He brings up like the whole Buddhism thing where it's like life is nothing, existence is emptiness or nothingness, which is not like, not necessarily a nihilistic thing, but if not carefully thinking about it, you can divulge very easily into nihilism, right? So you got to be careful about that. And Nietzsche's saying like, well, I think Nietzsche would say like, yeah, these type of religions ultimately drive people to nihilism. I would disagree, but I do think people often superficially embrace like that kind of idea of like, well, life is emptiness and ultimately nothing actually exists. That kind of non-Western thinking, Buddhism and different types of Hinduism. You're saying like, yeah, that kind of promotes nihilism. So there's that. The ultimate reality that life is nothingness. That's a problem. Or the problem of life's a bitch and then you die, the apathy. Or the problem of inherent worthlessness, like humanity is a piece of shit and I've lost my faith in humanity. He talks about how Adam and the original sin and that whole concept. And like, how do we get out of this hopelessness? And so, society has created a solution, which is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, which is the ultimate, like, well, all of that is covered, right? I've sacrificed myself to pay that debt off, and that's the solution that we have for this hopelessness, right? But let me continue. I skipped down one line only. That will to self-tormenting, that repressed cruelty of the animal man, made inward and sacred back into himself, the creature imprisoned in the state, so to be tamed, who invented the bad conscience in order to hurt himself after the more natural vent for this desire to hurt had been blocked. This man of the bad conscience has seized upon the presupposition of religion so as to drive his self-torture to its most gruesome pitch of severity and rigor, guilt before God. This thought becomes an instrument of torture to him. So the solution simply magnifies the problem. And so Nietzsche brings up this concept called bad conscience, where people are driven to hurt themselves or put themselves in like self-torture through like the beliefs that they have been willed onto by those more powerful than they are. And the ultimate manifestation of that is like the crucifixion of Christ. But Nietzsche is saying that only amplifies our drive, this bad conscience, to like continue hurting each other and hurting ourselves. Because now we're worshiping self-torture or torture as a kind of way of justifying life. Now I'm on top of page 93. In this psychical cruelty, there resides a madness of the will which is absolutely unexampled. The will of man to find himself guilty and reprehensible to a degree that can never be atoned for. His will to think himself punished without any possibility of the punishment becoming equal to the guilt. His will to infect the poison and the fundamental ground of things with the problem of punishment and guilt. And that just reiterates what we're talking about. The ideas that are constantly in our heads by society, like these religious ideas. We see this cross. We see like this man being tortured on this cross. And that is like the paying of the debt that we owe to just by existing, period. And that's just like the ultimate representation of how we view society and how like our morality is structured, where it's like, you know, you are inherently a horrible person and you need to be punished, right? And the way to be better is to be subjected to violence, right? And, you know, and if it's not violent, hurting others is also hurting yourself, right? It's hurting yourself and others. Violence is the way to become better, right? So we need to worship violence. We need to worship torture. And this is where we're at today. Let's read page 114. This is the second paragraph, the fifth line. The truly decisive history that determined the character of mankind when suffering was everywhere, countered as a virtue, cruelty as a virtue, dissembling as a virtue, revenge as a virtue, slander of reason as a virtue, and when on the other hand, well-being was counted as a danger, thirst for knowledge as a danger, peace as a danger, pity as a danger, being pitied as a disgrace, work as a disgrace, madness as divine, change as the very essence of immorality, and pregnant with disease. And this is page 115. The second to the last line of the first paragraph. Whoever has at some time built a new heaven has found the power to do so only in his own hell. And I put in my notes, society's morals manufacture suffering. So it's like things that hurt us are considered righteous, like revenge, slander, like, you know, talking shit with other people, you know, flame wars, arguing with each other, you know, exploiting each other, dominating each other. You know, these are things that are celebrated. And then when we're kind to people, when we're, you know, show compassion and we care about people, and maybe we even, you know, try and see each other as equal, that's considered, oh no, that's dangerous. That's like, you gotta watch out for that. That's not good. You know, are people getting hurt? No? Well, we don't want that, right? Or like seeking knowledge. Uh-oh, that's bad. Like, you know, banning books, right? Wokeness. Like, you know, you're like, you know, maybe we should be more kind to people. What are you, woke? you know, like that. That's it. Where we're at today. And we're creating our own hells because we're not able to rise over our fetishization of violence. Okay, let me read you page 162. This is the fourth line. The meaninglessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was the curse that lay over mankind so far, and the ascetic ideal offering man meaning. It was only meaning offered so far. Any meaning is better than none at all. Right? So that's the thing we're focused on. Like, sometimes there is no meaning to some things, and we got to be okay with that. But it's like, you know, the drive to associate meaning to all things has created a kind of perversion of meaning. Like, there's got to mean something. We got to find something there. And so we create all these weird, corrupted, warped, twisted versions of meaning to justify the meaningless. And it's really messing us up as human beings. In it, suffering was interpreted. The tremendous void seemed to have been filled. The door was closed to any kind of suicidal nihilism, right? Because these are those problems I was talking about. Suicidal nihilism, like, oh shit, man. You know, there's no meaning. There's so much suffering. I don't want to live in this kind of existence anymore. Let me create some sort of meaning, and then I can save myself, right? And so that's the void that's being filled. The interpretation, there is no doubt of it, brought fresh suffering with it, deeper, more inward, more poisonous, more life-destructive suffering. It placed all suffering on the perspective of guilt. So it didn't work like that kind of hardcore reaching of like creating anything to explain away the meaninglessness. It just created more guilt, and it created more suffering, more angst. Man was saved thereby. He possessed a meaning. He was henceforth no longer like a leaf in the wind, a plaything of nonsense, the senseless. He can now will something, no matter at first to what end. Why, with what he willed, the will itself was saved. So that's Nietzsche's bringing up, like, oh, this is an issue of will. It's because we're not able to exert our will. That's what's happening here. We're desperately trying to assert our will. We don't want to feel like our will is not being manifested or expressed. And that's what this is ultimately about. What is expressed by all that willing, which has taken its direction from the ascetic ideal, this hatred of the human and even more of the animal, and more still of the material, this horror of the senses, of reason itself, this fear of happiness and beauty, this longing to get away from all appearance, change, becoming, death, wishing from longing itself. All this means, let us dare to grasp it, a will to nothingness, an aversion to life, a rebellion against the most fundamental presuppositions of life. But it is and remains a will. And to repeat in conclusion what I said at the beginning, man would rather will nothingness than not will. Right? So I put in my notes here. The desperation to associate meaning to suffering is a kind of will to power. Forcing the experience of suffering into an expression of one's will simply causes more suffering. This creates a perpetual downward spiral of angst that reiterates the will further and further into suffering, right? So, you know, Nietzsche's argument is like, look, all human beings have this drive to manifest their will, right? You know, this will to power that he calls this drive. But the problem is human beings oftentimes don't know how to exert that drive, the will to power, in a constructive, useful way. So Nietzsche argues that morality, like our morality, is an example of the will to power gone awry, right? Is gone astray, and is the will to power actually like being used in a corrupted way that's actually harming us as a species, right? And that's, you know, what Nietzsche wants to say on morality. Morality has very little to do with what is actually right and what's wrong, or what's good and what's evil. You know, he wrote another book, Beyond Good and Evil, right? Morality or ethics are just about man's will to power. Like, that's what it's about ultimately, which is a great, you know, honestly, a really interesting way to think of it. And I think there's more truth in there than we like to think about. I would say, like, you know, in terms of how do we interpret that into today's society and the conditions of today, where I think like he identified several problems like apathy, this blind obsession with violence, either like religion deifying violence, or even just like our social institutions, like the criminal justice system, which uses violence and punishment as a form to derive justice, which it's been doing that, and nobody is really getting any sense of justice. So their society becomes apathetic and nihilistic, because it's like, well, I'm not being satisfied here. Does life have no meaning? What's going on? We just have to, like Nietzsche said, we gotta rise above these notions that we have, that our institutions are putting onto us, and we kind of have to like create our own versions of justice, and I would argue like, well, there's transformative justice, there's restorative justice, there's versions of justice that don't rely on violence and punishment. It is that obsession that we have with violence and trauma that is ultimately driving us toward warped senses of morality, right? And we really do need to examine what we think is moral these days, and where is that coming from? So even the title itself, the Genealogy of Morals, we'll discuss this one later. That's another, but right now we're focusing on the Genealogy of Morals. Where does morals come from? How have they developed over time, and how have they evolved? Morality, ethics is, it is a very good work. I could see how somebody could say like, yeah, the Genealogy of Morals is Nietzsche's best work. I can see that. I still would argue like Thus Spoke Zarathustra is probably his greatest work, his magnum opus. Well, and then I would also argue the Antichrist is probably better. I like the Antichrist a lot. That's also an extremely good work. But the Genealogy of Morals is up there. So check it out. I think it's a great read. It'll get you thinking about morality and ethics. And when Nietzsche is good, he's really good. Well, you've been watching the Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.